Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. This is Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Eric Deepen. I am the pastor at the Village Church in Tucson, Arizona, and across from me is Andy Littleton, pastor of Mission Church in Tucson, Arizona. Yours is a little bit more Midtown. Mine's a little bit Midtown East.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for us, I really liked this podcast.
Yeah, I did too.
I feel like we talked about the gospel, we talked about Jesus, what he's doing in our community, in our life, how we think about things.
This is one of those ones where I forgot there were microphones, sort of.
Yeah.
But I like that.
Yeah, that's good.
Like, I would have just enjoyed this conversation with you, even if we didn't record it.
Yeah.
Those are the best.
They are the best.
So,
enjoy. Enjoy. And we're going to be off for a month.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
You did. I told you last week. And you changed your calendar even because I got the calendar notification.
Oh, good for me. Okay, well, look at that. Perfect.
There you go. All right. Well, have a good day, guys. Bye. Hey, it's Money Talk with Eric Deepen and Andy Littleton.
Eric Ramsey.
Eric Ramsey.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm here. My phone just buzzed, and I'm not going to look at it.
It's okay.
Yeah.
You're a better person. Like, we've already established you're a better person.
No, we haven't.
Yes.
No, we have not. We have not established
You're a better
that.
Calvinist. You're a better person.
Better Calvinist.
Yeah, you're definitely a better Calvinist. Let's be honest.
Look at you. You're wearing a bandana. You're definitely a better Calvinist.
No, maybe a neo-Calvinist, but you're just straight up better Calvinist.
Really? Oh, wow. Oh, some Calvinists would disagree.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, they certainly wouldn't think that I was up there.
Well, sure. That's okay. Yeah.
You're definitely
Granted.
above me.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm too much into the neo-Orthodox people to be considered Calvinist. So we just said a bunch of things that people don't even know we're talking about. So.
Yeah. This podcast is off to a real bang. I still don't know what we're talking about. What are we? You mentioned something about talking about God. I like that.
Well, no, I think
that's good.
That it would be
this is Faith
cool.
Over Breakfast.
Did you? It is Faith Over Breakfast. Did you preach this Sunday?
I did not.
What was preached on this Sunday?
So we're in Galatians 2, and this was Paul's asserting his apostolic ministry, and John talked about leaders, what it means to have leaders supporting them and such.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Because I was just thinking that we have two churches, as we've said previously and over again, that are self-proclaimed different than other churches. Mm-hmm. And some people would observe that they are. But they're different in that they have maybe a more narrow purpose or a narrow audience that they're looking to bring the gospel to.
Yeah.
And they approach life and community a little differently, life together. And I sometimes wonder, like, well, what is God saying to these communities? How is he directing them, and how does that intersect with each other? That kind of interests me, because I think we're both trying to bring Jesus's message to people that maybe don't always hear it, but we're also pretty concerned with what does it look like to make disciples, like lifelong disciples who are committed to an idea and to a way of being that is consuming in some ways.
Yeah. Well, let's do that. I like that. So you're wondering what we're saying to our people, and you would share with us what you're saying to yours.
Yeah. And maybe we could kind of interact
Compare
with
notes.
that.
Yeah. Let's go for it.
All right.
Look at that. We have a topic.
Yeah.
So we chose the book of Galatians because we realized we had two impulses, and we went with the one that wasn't the most easy path. And the two impulses were, number one was we could say, my goodness, 2020 was so rough. Let's just have a really easy year. That'd be something where you're like, let's pick a book of the, let's just pick a book of the Bible that's just like salve to the wound, and try to just not really talk about some of these hard things. So there was that idea. And then the other would be, wow, 2020 stirred the pot. And there's a whole lot of things we've become aware of. Let's press into what do we do with that rather than just letting all the sediment float down to the bottom again. Because all the issues, they're not going to just go away. That sounded like the harder path. And that's the one we picked. So we chose the book of Galatians because in it, Paul was dealing with something that was a very cultural, political, divisive topic of his day, circumcision. He was recognizing that even within the church, there were differing impulses and feelings about it. And he roots an argument in the gospel for how one ought to engage with the issue. So we thought, okay, this gives us an opportunity to talk about the gospel a lot, but also to recognize that it has a lot to say to divisive, difficult topics. So we're doing that. And then for the summer, we're going to look at the 12 disciples and how different they were and think through what it really took for Jesus to bring them all together to follow him, and discuss kind of community and the diversity of community and how complicated that is, but also how it's possible because of Jesus. So that's our year. That's the plan. How about you guys?
Well, so
you took option one.
We took option one. No.
Yeah.
So last year we, before we hit Advent, we did Ephesians. So we did the whole book of Ephesians. Mm-hmm. And at the end, we landed on the armor of God. And during the sermon on the armor itself, in our kind of response, there was this overwhelming response in the few people that came to each service.
Yeah.
Overwhelming response.
Hey, when 5 people are overwhelmed, you better listen.
That maybe we need to stop here and look at these different aspects of the armor of God.
Yeah.
And we don't, usually we have our sermon series prepped. So we scrapped 2021's beginning up to Lent because we kind of follow church calendar. And we began to pick each one apart.
Yeah.
And that's been a huge transforming experience for our community.
Good.
And really beginning to understand what it means to get your feet rooted in a time when things are not very rooted, like where everything seems to be shifting around you.
Yeah.
So that whole encouragement of stand firm and the invitation to stand in the strength of God, and then begin to take up and put on the things that you're given, has been a really, really powerful place for us to ponder things. So I think for us, it was like, when I look back at 2020, I realized that, kind of went in naive. I don't think I'll ever go into a year naive again, where I was just like, hey, it's a year, I
remember joking about like themes for, just we were talking about 2020 and joking about like, hey, let's just call it 2020 vision. But being in this kind of space of just expecting nothing strange.
Right.
Just just assuming we were going to talk about discipleship, and that was that.
Well, and I think the things that we had on our plate as a community that we were thinking was like, okay, we're looking at some financial struggle in our church. So it's going to be hard. Right. So we need to buckle down heading into 2020, and we're going to grow. We're going to grow a lot. The evidence
and those two flipped, didn't they?
They did. They flipped completely.
You less people and more money.
Yes. And so just how you think we're listening to the Holy Spirit, we're doing what we're making choices to plan on where we think God is calling us and what we're looking at. And God's like, yeah, you just don't know.
Right.
I appreciate that you're trusting me and leaping off a cliff, but you don't know.
But by the way, the cliff,
We're
it's
moving.
a whole different cliff than you thought.
Right.
Yeah.
We're moving in a different direction. So like coming into 2021 has definitely been more like, okay, no, we don't know.
Yeah.
We could make some decisions, but we need to be ready to change those things and adjust. And so we're doing Lent, and this has been, we are talking about the parables that come out of Matthew 13.
Oh, cool.
So we're kind of going to beat these ideas to death in a sense.
Yeah.
So we start with the sower.
Yeah.
There's the mustard seed and things like that.
In which, something that didn't stand out to me until a few years back was that the kingdom always grows in these parables.
Yes, the kingdom is always growing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're very subversive and very. The cool thing about a parable is you unravel it, and you think about it, and it has so much to it, and then you stop thinking about it, and it unravels back up.
Right.
And the next time you read it, you don't just go back to your standard interpretation. It's all of a sudden like, oh wow, Eugene Peterson says parables are set up for us not to learn new things, but to see things we didn't see before.
Yeah.
They invite us back onto the path to think about what's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for us, like, it's been really good for Lent to go into the parable of the sower because, there's some ways of understanding how lavish God's grace is and the pouring out of the seed on everywhere. Yes, there's a field, but it's given to all these different soils. Reality is given to everyone.
Yeah, there's a field and it doesn't always grow. We tend to look at that like, what kind of soil are you?
Yes.
But there is something to the lavish generosity of the God that pours seed all over all types of soil. He doesn't come, if you think about the parable, the sower doesn't walk up and go, which one of these soils is worth it?
Right.
Which one of these soils is, ready for me?
Yeah.
He just pours it out.
Yeah. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that really has struck me is this time, and I do talk about this parable when I preach on it, there is some self-examination and invitation of like what kind of soil you are.
Yes, not to diminish that.
No, but I think the thing that struck me this time more was that that God is the sower.
Yeah.
And Jesus is the seed.
Yeah.
But Jesus is the sower of the seed himself into his disciples, who then are sowing seed, who I'm a product of.
The seed is kind of passed along.
Yes. And some of what's going on there is for us to think about, well, what kind of soil is my seed hitting and how am I to pray? So if I look at, am I throwing seed and people already have a well-worn path and it's so easy for reality just to bounce off them. And I'm just like, well, I got to convince them more. Maybe I need to start praying that the Spirit of God who makes people alive so they can receive the seed.
And
Good Calvinist there.
Tills ground and wow,
Yes.
look at you being a Calvinist.
It's my job to pray that the Spirit would engage that way, and also to pray that the Spirit would protect them from the birds, from the enemy, snatching reality before it can grab root. And just thinking about those things, just the way I pray, I have to start thinking, well, this is how parenting works.
Yeah.
Right? You're throwing out what is good and true, what is real, Jesus, hopefully, to your kids. But then you're like, wow, that just bounces off you. Mm-hmm. You already have a well-worn path in your life that I need to pray out of you. And maybe as a parent, I need to also redirect you, but I might be the agent of the Spirit in your life.
Right.
But I don't know. So those have really been helpful thoughts for me to process. This, how do I pray for people in the soil that they are?
Yeah.
And how do I rejoice when it takes root? What does that look like?
Yeah.
Just really challenging my heart that way. And I think it's challenging my community to think that way.
No, that's great.
But that's kind of where we're at as a community.
Yeah. Yeah, that's powerful stuff.
One thing it would be interesting to have a conversation about, it was just a little side note of our sermon, my sermon on Sunday that I've just been, it just always strikes me is that, you think about Jesus, you think at some point, like, he just floats around. Like, your initial thing is like he just floats from, like, he's God, you know? I mean, I said in my sermon, if he has to pee, he can say, well, I'll do that next week. Like, I don't need to
Or
pee
he just
right
miraculously does.
now. Yeah.
He just, it's like, I just spiritually peed.
Yeah, it's like, but he's human, and he is fulfilling prophecy in a human way.
Yeah.
He knows what he's fulfilling, and he has to make decisions to do it, and he has to be strategic, and he has to tell stories certain ways.
Right.
I don't think we think of him as that human.
Yeah.
Who's purposeful.
Right. No, it's true. And I don't know, and this is slightly related, but have you seen that little mini documentary Godspeed?
No, I haven't.
It's so Eugene Peterson's involved in it, and N.T. Wright and a couple other people.
Oh, wow.
But basically, there's this pastor who is training in seminary.
Oh, yes, I've heard about it.
You've heard of it, yeah. And he's going to do all these great things, and I believe Eugene Peterson sees in him, this isn't good. You're too driven, and suggests to him that he goes, I believe, to Scotland, to this little tiny parish in Scotland. And from there, he gets assigned to an even smaller one. And basically, there, the whole role is you just have to walk around to the various people's homes and just be with them and pray with them. And he discovers that it changes his preaching because the people actually know who he is, as opposed to the type of church he thought he'd lead where people wouldn't know who he was. And so they would say, okay, you said that with all this passion, but where's that passion on Tuesday for you? And he realized he couldn't talk like an expert anymore. He had to come to them honestly. And then one of the first converts he sees is this kind of manly macho man that who goes out with his friends and just tromps around naked in the forest and just is like manly man. You know, in Scotland, I guess that's what manly men do. Yeah,
wow, I don't know about that.
Yeah, they probably do it here too. Just don't
know.
Especially at the village.
To stay away from those men.
Yeah, but he was kind of this larger than life guy, and he is looking at the maps in a Bible when he's meeting with the pastor, and he realizes when he's looking at the maps, because his whole area, he can walk to the neighboring town, all the things, and he's looking at the scale on the maps, and it dawns on this guy that everywhere Jesus went in his whole entire ministry was within walking distance. Everything. And he says, unbelievable. If these people wrote about him, that he raised Lazarus from the dead and that he did this miracle here, and that all these people were so close to one another, they were within walking distance. There's no way that if this was all lies, that all the people in the community wouldn't have gathered together and said, no, he didn't do it. And he just said he must have been who these people said he was, because there's not a historical uproar about it. These people all knew who he was. It was like the furthest, it was like East Tucson to North Tucson. It was like the furthest away or something of that nature. And this guy accepts Christianity because of the map, right?
That is really interesting.
It is really interesting. But anyway, all that to say, the humanness of Jesus, that he had to walk to all these, he had to get up in the morning and, okay, I got to walk for 3 hours to get over there. And there were a lot of cool things in that video, but that was one of the ones, because I enjoy walking, and this is,
sure,
it really touched on me that he didn't just float around. He had to trudge all the way over there to see this person. And they really knew what he was like.
Yeah. I think it must have been last year, because we did some in Acts, and we were preaching on where, when Peter goes and he heals. Is it Tabitha up in the upper room? She's dead or whatever. Yeah, she's dead. And I believe. And the one who made all of the stuff for the widows and stuff like that. Anyway, I realized that he's on this little check on the churches tour when they come and get him. And I'm like, wait a minute, he's just doing what Jesus did. He's just wandering from these little towns, checking on the little church, see how how are you guys doing?
Right.
And he's going and staying with another guy. And it's very normal. It's just normal life. And then all of a sudden the miraculous inserts itself into it. And I think that's...
he wasn't on a mission to do some huge thing. It
Right.
was, he's doing the normal things, and then, boom, out of nowhere, this is going on.
Right.
And God does something incredible.
Well, and I think that, and I think maybe because of Americans, we're like, manifest destiny and all of these things, we catch, like we hook into like Paul, and Paul, they don't have a lot, Luke doesn't have a lot of room to write about Paul's actions. So he's got to write about the exciting moments of Paul's life.
And that's just ancient literature. You don't read the mundane. We, in our new modern literature, we like to dig into all the mundane and the dirt and the flaws, and we want to see the human behind the great,
Yeah, sure.
Back then, that wasn't how they wrote. They got to the highlights and generally skip most of the mundane.
Right, and you'll hear, and for 2 years I made tents, and then there's like 3 events in those 2 years that's what you're going to read about is those 3 events.
And you read back on this and you go, wow, Paul did all these incredible things. Well, imagine if you actually stretched that timeline and thought about how much time elapsed between interesting events. Like, there was a year between anything miraculous or something,
Right.
Or he just made tents for 2 years of mostly just making tents. All the days where he woke up and all he did was make a tent that day and went home and crashed.
And chatted with whoever he was making tents with.
The great apostle Paul. Yeah.
That's very interesting. It's funny too. Caleb Thomas was telling me this morning, he's like, do you realize that Luke wrote 29% of the New Testament? Like, he's the dominant voice. He writes more than Paul does. Paul dominates a good chunk of the narrative.
It has more books, but they're short. Yeah.
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 And it's like, Luke, who just appears out of nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Not a disciple.
Nope.
Yep.
Just a doctor.
Yep.
With some money behind him. Does some writing.
Yep.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Makes you think.
Yep.
But
I think we, in our day, we want to see results and we want to plan for results. I mean, I'm like this.
Yeah.
I'm not throwing stones right now. This is me. And but it is helpful to go back and go, okay, those who were trying to follow had so many days with no results. That's okay. Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about, so you choose Galatians because Galatians deals with how the gospel applies to a particular conflict that's existing within the church. It's a mixed church, by the way, the Gentile and Jewish church. And so circumcision is the
issue.
It's the issue, but it's got a deeper underlying issue in it that Paul goes after with the gospel.
And there's a lot of layers to this issue. There's political layers in that they, in maintaining their circumcision, they were maintaining their distinction that some sectors of Rome had even outlawed. And so it was resistance for them to maintain circumcision. And here's Paul saying, let it go.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to let go of this thing that we fought for politically? What? So there's that. There's kind of the issue of race that falls into there. Like, this is important. Like, this is our distinction as a race. And you're going to, and if people convert into our religion, they're supposed to take on these characteristics. They're supposed to acclimate. Paul's saying no. That would actually be a denial of the gospel. That's hard for them to hear. What else are you? Yeah, those are a couple of interesting. And then there's the theological implications of accepting anything else as making you righteous other than the gospel itself. Paul, of course, elsewhere tells people to go get circumcised. He recommends it because not to put a unnecessary stumbling block in front of Jewish people. So he's not against circumcision in all cases, but when it becomes your righteousness, he's adamantly against it. And there's a lot to say there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think his whole thing about trying to pull people under Christ in their identity is important to him in Galatians.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, so as you look at that, and this is just, how does that like talk to your community? Like how, because now those issues are at play in our culture, but not circumcision. We're not having that conversation anymore, at least in the churches I'm in. We're not having that conversation.
Yeah, so you're having to help people, imagine the parallels between this and the situations we've faced lately in our context. And it's not the simplest thing in the world, because you have to, I mean, I'm not so much going after, and I don't want to go after, what should you vote for?
Right.
Or what do you, I mean, we had that conversation. We talked about being political disciples last year, and some common good talk, and what is God's call to a citizen, how they to think about their neighbor. And so this is more because these divisions have hit us as a community, and we feel it. I mean, there are people who in our church that can't talk to each other. I mean, there are. And we know that some of them aren't engaging with that, but we can see it. I think as leaders, we've felt the pressure from like one side or the other, and we know that those people aren't talking. And if they did, it would be explosive. If there is like frustrated and it's hitting us who are not like. All of our leaders are sort of in this somewhat middle position where we are not like representing polar ends of this spectrum here.
Right.
And we're like, well, if we're getting it that strong, imagine if you had the conversation with your brother over here. And so just, I think, recognizing, I mean, that's what we want to go after is, what is it? Because we've heard people say, well, it's just preach the gospel, then it'll clear all this up. Well, Galatians doesn't just preach it preaches the gospel through showing how the gospel moves you through this particular issue, and shows how critical the gospel is to laying down something concerning this issue, or upholding something like there is no righteousness outside of Christ. That's a doctrinal thing you stand on to move you through this issue. So we're trying to work it out more for the sake of our people knowing how to navigate very difficult and potentially divisive things. Yeah. Because they're there.
Yeah.
If they weren't there, then it'd just be, I mean, not that you shouldn't, we probably should have talked about it before 2020, right? But yeah.
Or we're learning to refine how to talk about it. I mean, trial like this teaches leaders how to do these things. Like what we don't necessarily know if we haven't really come up against it in this particular way.
And you don't know how it works out in your community till it occurs.
Yeah, this is true.
Right.
So I've been thinking about this idea, and it kind of triggers what you're saying, kind of triggers this. But when it comes to the gospel, I think a lot of times we as followers of Jesus and leaders, as we talk about it, forget that the gospel is about announcing whose kingdom you are in.
Yes. And
what gets you into that kingdom.
Right.
And then what its values are.
And how you now live within this kingdom.
Right. And
it's not just that, and there's like the truncated gospel, which is just Jesus saves you from your sins, but Jesus announced a kingdom.
Right.
Yeah, it's a big, the good news is actually really good and really holistic.
And it is what's real.
Yeah.
I think it is what is reality. And I think a lot of times, and this is definitely what I slip into, I think my people that I think Christians in general slip into this, is that we think that the values of the gospel in the kingdom are behavioral. Right. Do this, don't do this.
Sure.
Don't associate with this, associate with that. Don't. And I think what we miss and what's really difficult is the values of the kingdom have to do with humility. The values of the kingdom have to do with vulnerability. They have to do with having the purpose of the king and not the purpose of me.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and
mind.
strength, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Is in it like that encapsulation of the kingdom is so like antithetical to me as a human being.
It's utterly unearthing.
And I think this last night we were talking at the dinner table, and Ashton, my daughter, is in a class where they're talking about how computers are taking over jobs that they can do, just better than humans.
Right.
But one thing computers can't do is provide empathy. This is the thing that they run into all the time.
Yeah.
In replacing, for instance, you can't necessarily have a computer be your customer care because it doesn't know how to empathize.
Have you seen those, they were like I want to call it robo cops. When Michaela and I were in San Francisco, they had these robots walking around that could potentially be like security guards or police, and they were just getting people's response to them, and they were filming it, and they're your size, and they walk up to you and they can communicate with you, and it's pretty wild to deal with. But to imagine that this is your security guard and the complexity of dealing with a security guard in a tense situation, this robot can't understand me and what I might be afraid of right now,
right,
and then respond like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was struck by the fact that when the Spirit of God comes in you, you actually can offer true empathy.
Yeah.
Whereas when the Spirit of God isn't in you, you may be able to offer a form of empathy, but not true empathy, because you're not made alive by the Spirit and have a kingdom way of empathizing. I think a way of hearing and understanding and not having your yourself in the way. Because I think what the Spirit does, through the resurrection and death on the cross, is get us out of the way so that Jesus is now in between you and I. And so I can now look at you through the eyes of Jesus, which is not the way I normally would look at you, right? I have that gift where, I don't know if that's possible. People get so mad at me, and I get upset. People get mad when I say, look, like people who don't follow Jesus cannot offer the same kind of empathy, grace, and kindness that someone who does. It may look that way, but it does not come from the Spirit of God. Now, it may come out of something we call common grace and what happens in that process, but it is not the same as being loved by someone who has been made alive by Jesus, who loves you as Jesus.
Right.
The
pushback on that is that's not fair to other really kind and good people out there or something like that.
Oh, yeah. No, that is the pushback. I get it all the time.
Yeah. I agree, though, that it's never just the action or the behavior, but the motive behind it that empowers it. And so when it's motivated by a kingdom of grace and reconciliation, that always will be different than when it's motivated by being, whatever motive somebody might have. Like, I want to be the best person I can be, or I just want to make the world a better place for my children who come after me. Those are very different motives.
Right. And I don't want to. I always clarify and say, look, when someone offers something that looks that way, it is a gift of the Spirit, of which you and I, who have the Spirit, are called to recognize it and proclaim that that's what it is, and invite that person to embrace what they offered unknowingly.
And sometimes there is something to say that was really good. Think about where that really comes from. And that gets back to the seed and being scattered all over the place. Sometimes people live out of something they don't even see. Yeah.
So, can it have the impact of the Spirit of God on someone else? Yes, because it's God's. Whatever is good is
mercy
God.
is mercy, right?
Yeah. So I'm not saying, but there's something powerful about the Spirit of God working in a person who loves God and offers that love.
Yeah.
It's life-changing. It's world-changing, I think. And I think that's when I think about Galatians, ultimately that's what Paul is trying to do in Galatians, is to invite people into something deeper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because they're so identity-driven. And, you and I are that way. Like, we are, we're Americans. Yeah. a particular kind of Christian. We were joking about Calvinists earlier in the
Right.
podcast. Like, that's an identity that honestly has nothing to do with Jesus.
Right.
It's a way that you and I can understand ourselves.
Right.
And then it can become divisive. And
Yeah. And I think, as far as Calvinism goes, I think John Calvin himself would be really frustrated that people have named themselves after him and done some of the things they've done
sure.
in the name of his system. So even for his sake.
Right. Even for his sake.
Yeah. Probably not the best thing to anchor yourself in. Read him. He was a wise man in many regards, and also very flawed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you were talking before we got on this podcast about anxiety and fear and how you just sense that in people in your community. And I would agree.
Yeah.
Internally, I have it.
Oh,
and
sure.
I've had it over this year
Right.
and how it impacts us. What do you, where you're at now with what you're telling your community, or even just in your own walk with God, and how does God speak to that? How do we offer that peace, the peace that passes understanding, the peace that the world doesn't give?
Yeah. I've been my paraphrase of that has been peace that makes no sense.
Right.
We want the peace that makes sense. We want the thing that gives us peace. We want to get the finances in order and we'll get peace. Get the bad voices to go away and we'll get peace. That peace makes sense. The peace God offers comes from somewhere else and transcends everything that you would understand. So you can have it in the midst of a riot and in the midst of a nation falling apart, in the midst of grief. That peace can be with you. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was sharing that with you because that's an insight that I've been slow to come to, is that our people who are most divided are our most anxious. And I should have seen it sooner. It makes sense, but it's just, I guess, landing with me, or a little bit more. I'm tuned into it in the lives of some, but not all. And so I think that's something I'm going to be pondering as we move forward. I mean, for us, and I'm sure this is true for you, you make this plan for the year, and I tend to stick mostly with the sermons that I planned, but they do get shaped by the things you observe throughout the year and the lives of our folks. And that's, so every discovery will get woven in somehow. But I think there is, it was really nice the other day to just get to talk about grace. I mean, it was the scriptures I was on was just saturating us in grace, and that's all I talked about. So there will be many such moments, I think, as we go. We won't just talk about divisive things. We will get into that when the text gets there. But this next sermon is where Paul talks about when he went before the Jerusalem council and they encouraged him to remember the poor. Why was that? In this big divisive moment, potentially they all said, "Oh, sure, yeah, they don't need to be circumcised, but do remember the poor." So that's what we'll talk about this time.
That's really interesting.
So we're going to come at a lot of different things, but anyway, yeah, no, I have work to do to think how to apply this to that anxiety. I have a lot of thoughts, but I have a lot of work to do, and to think about these disparate groups of people we have, both with deep anxieties, afraid of each other, and how to encourage them toward oneness in Christ.
Yeah.
And that is, at the end of the day, going to have to be a Spirit of God thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, Rush Limbaugh died this last week, right?
Right.
And I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh in 1990 when he had like 50 radio stations. And what I realized as I reflected on this person who actually had a dramatic impact on my political life in the beginning is that, there's some good things about what he offered, but mostly as his show progressed, what he offered was anxiety.
Yes.
And I noticed this in so many areas of what our world is putting out on TV, in the radio, on YouTube, is that we're putting out anxiety or distraction.
Yeah.
Right. So if you look at TikTok, which is so fast, right? They're offering you distraction, very quick distraction. I'm distracted. I don't actually have to touch down in this heart of mine. I don't have to feel anything.
Yeah.
It's a legal drug is what it is. It's just
and the insidious part of it is that at some level, the content creators know that that's what people will drink deeply of.
Right.
Distraction and anxiety. Things that make us anxious, we have to have more. We have to figure it out. But it doesn't cure the anxiety. It fuels the anxiety.
Right. Well, even think of some of the content you guys produce at Mission Church on your little YouTube videos. Right. The ones that have 400 views on them are ones where you're talking about controversial issues that produce some form of anxiety. But if you're saying, hey, this is the information for this week, and here's some stuff that you guys should think about.
Nobody watches
30 people look at it, or 50 people, or 50 views, which means, 18 people watched it or whatever. You don't have as many. And I think that's what the content producers know. They're like, oh, we know that this is what produces views. And so we do this.
And we've and to pitch in on that, we didn't realize when we did the little thing on Jerry Falwell, it was more just like, whoa, this is crazy. And then we're like, why did we get so many more? How did this one get out there? And you realize, well, it's algorithms. It's, they know that this people are anxious about this or frustrated. So they're looking it up. So it gets picked up by some more people or whatever. And you get comments you're like, who is this person?
Right.
Well, so then we were like, okay, that's happening. What do you do with that information? And so just a little insight into our minds is we've started to kind of go, okay, we have to be really careful with that, because if we just incite the fear or the frustration, then we haven't stewarded this well at all. But if we utilize a topic that people are really interested in and try to talk about something that to get around to hope and to get around to something more anchoring to the soul, that might be okay. It might be okay to talk about the things people are afraid of if you don't leave them on the tune of fear.
Right.
And so almost a little bit of what would it be like to think of those topics as like a Trojan horse of sorts, like, oh, we're talking about Carl Lentz, whoa. But then you get done, you're like, oh, that was only a little bit about Carl Lentz. We really ended up thinking about something else. And I would say those are still germinating ideas that we're
working
trying to, but it's a weird realization to have. When that one video went big, I went, oh, I'm big. Big, like big as in nothing compared to some people. But
well, I mean, for a little church, 400 views of a video is actually pretty good.
Right.
I mean, oddly enough, this podcast is in the top 25% of all podcasts, oddly enough.
See, I don't believe you.
No, it is.
Okay. Yeah. Cool.
That means there's probably a million other podcasts.
There's so many podcasts, yeah.
There are millions and millions of podcasts.
Yeah.
And they just don't last as long as ours.
Yeah, we're just stubborn.
We are in the turtle and the hare. We are definitely the turtle.
Yeah.
We're just, 30 years from now, we'll just be saying, oh, hey.
Oh, hey, it's Sarah. Hey, take your phone off the counter. Yeah.
And then it'll just be like, could you please turn off the thing implanted in your brain so I can hear the buzz in my headphones?
Right.
Oh, man.
Anyway, sorry. All that to say, how do we do that? There are probably a lot of good answers that I need to think through that more. I think, like I said, it's dawning on me more than it was before.
Yeah.
last week or so.
It's funny, Brene Brown talks, all about vulnerability and
Yep.
all that kind of stuff. But when you look at Jesus, you're like, wait a minute, Brene, and I know Brene is a Christian, but
Is she?
yeah, she is.
I thought, yeah, never mind.
I mean,
I wasn't sure if she was.
I know she attends
Okay.
an Episcopal church, I believe.
Yeah.
So she has some
There's a lot of built-in
spiritual influence.
furniture.
Yes, there's some furniture in it. But vulnerability is the value of the kingdom of God. You are just telling people what we should have been practicing
Right.
and talking about ourselves, because this is
Right.
who Jesus is. He came vulnerable as a baby. He relied on Joseph interpreting dreams to get him to the places he needed to be.
Yeah,
right?
isn't that wild?
Yeah, Caleb Thomas and I were chatting about that this morning, and it's just kind of mind-blowing
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah. I know it is.
Vulnerability changes us, especially when it's a Christ-driven vulnerability. Right? Because you were talking about that piece, and the piece that it is I do not have to defend myself. I do not have to
Fix this
fix
problem.
things.
Yeah.
But I have to trust
Yeah.
that God is good in this.
Yeah.
And when I do that, my soul's at rest because it's with Him and not with.
And then your soul can be at rest no matter what's happening.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean you don't feel pain. I think sometimes you're right.
Yeah.
That we think of peace as I don't have to experience this pain. I don't have to experience this
Right.
discouragement. I don't have to experience. No, actually, peace says, yeah, you do.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. And let's walk. Let's go.
It's like experiencing the presence of Jesus in the middle of pain or grief or trial.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the light to the world. Everybody knows what it's like to get really angry when you're threatened. That's not really a light to the world. A light to the world is to have peace in the midst of darkness, fear, death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's, we talk about, I think sometimes the message gets confused, and when we say, yes, followers of Jesus need to be willing to be taken advantage of, we're not talking about abusive relationships. What we're talking about is a people who stand between other people and choose to be taken, volunteer to be taken advantage of for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the goodness of the other, or to protect someone else. Not just for the sake of being taken advantage of or in an abusive relationship. But there's a purpose and meaning to the stepping in and allowing injustice to happen to you, to call people to something bigger. Those are beautiful things to talk about. Really, really hard, to do. Because, a lot of times that's just happening with your kid or your marriage or your neighbor whose things are growing over to the side of your house and doesn't really cut them down or won't fight you over.
Are you dealing with that right now?
No, but it's the classic one, right? Your neighbor's doing the thing that you don't want him to do. Right. What does that look like for you to be Jesus to that neighbor?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's really hard to do it even in those small areas.
Yes, it's very hard.
Which is kind of like maybe we should master it in those small areas before we go try to master it in the political sphere. Or something. It's, I once knew a budding politician in a previous
lifetime
church circle. But it was one of those things where life's a wreck, terrible relationships, but he's going to go fix the country, and it's just that simple stuff and you realize that's not just him, that's all of us. We're all thinking that way. We have this big, if the world would do this, like, man, you're not even, I don't even have it down with my kid.
Right.
Who do I think I am? Yeah. What's up with that?
We're very broken.
We are. And delusional.
And that's why we need one another. I think the pandemic has been hard in that way, is that we're already a disconnected people before the pandemic.
And the one anothering has almost been off limits, or like that's the big faux pas. You can't be with one another.
Right.
And I don't want to be the one who's just like, nobody can tell us we can't go to church, because I don't even think that's the issue.
No.
Like, going to church
is important,
but that's not so much what I'm saying. It's, it is like getting the nuance and inflection and seeing your friend break down into tears and That's what we lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We lost, and it's been hard.
Yeah.
It has been hard. But God's inviting us into new stuff.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
To go full circle and say, we didn't know 2020 was coming, and we don't know what's going to happen in 2021.
Right. Yeah, I think there's there early in the year, in the first sermons, I remember I was just thinking, what is it with all the rose-colored glasses? Everybody's like, 2020's over. And I'm like, what are you talking about?
Right.
This January 1 thing isn't really, if you believe in God or the universe or whatever,
right.
The whole thing didn't just reset.
No, it did really.
Yeah.
God pushes a reset button.
He's like, okay, that year's over and done. And now we're foolish to think that there isn't a set of beautiful things and a set of difficulties.
Right. And it certainly felt probably more like this because we had an election change or a change of president. So you think, well, now we have a different person, even if it's
right.
So that maybe aided in the rose-colored glasses for people.
For a group of people, yes.
Yeah, not everybody.
Another group of people
made it worse. Yeah,
yeah.
But I mean, I'll even confess I've had rose-colored glasses. I mean, I've been telling people, but because I'm listening to doctors and scientists and people, and I'm like, May, June, this is gonna be real different.
Yeah,
it's gonna be different at church. It's gonna be different everywhere. Right. But I don't know that.
We don't know that.
But I have rose-colored glasses. So.
Yeah,
and it's okay.
Well, you don't want to go around with all, I don't know, foggy glasses either, right?
No.
There's something to having, there's general optimism, which it's easier to live that way, I guess, from just a pragmatic standpoint. If you dread tomorrow, it's really hard. If you think, hey, I think a good thing might be around the corner, those people tend to be a little happier. That's, we can't all access that. It doesn't work for everybody. But it's not a bad thing. Enjoy it while it's there.
Yeah.
And then there's hope. And I think that's a whole nother... Hope is more of like a soul anchor in the goodness of God. That where the soul... the soul's anchor is hooked on a immovable stone of the goodness of God. And sometimes you have to yank on that and make sure, like, is that still there? When a ship is adrift and it's the chain going to the anchor is loose, you forget. And sometimes you have to drift off and that has to tighten up for you to remember. And at the end of the day, optimism's fine, but we need hope.
You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.